There was a small village at the edge of a very great woods. And in this village, a young girl was born completely mute. She could not speak a word, she could not make a sound. And because of this, she was the subject of a great deal of teasing and ridicule by the other people in the village. And so she did the only thing that she knew to make herself feel better. She went to the woods. The woods was the one place where she could always go that she could feel safe, where she didn't have to worry about the teasing and the taunting of the villagers. Now, about the same time this young girl was born in the village, a young boy was born also, and he could speak and shout and make all kinds of noise. But he did have something different about him. He was a little bit out of rhythm with life. He was clumsy, and he was always tripping over his feet and bumping into people, and anything he touched seemed to break on its own. And he was always being teased just like the girl was, even by his own family. And so he did what the young girl did. He went to the woods. And because they shared the woods in common, they grew to become very close friends. And one day they were out and exploring the woods, and they had learned more about the woods than anyone in their village had ever learned. And they hear a rustling in the bushes to their left. And they walk over and they move the bushes back. And there laying on the ground was a young eagle that someone had shot. And they both stood there unsure what to do because neither one had ever seen an eagle up close before. But the boy, being rather impulsive, immediately gets an idea. We can save it. It can live with us. It can be our new best friend. And the girl gave him a look like, that's probably not a good idea. And she motioned to the sky as if to say, maybe there's a mother and father eagle nearby that'll come and take care of it. The boy ignored her. The seed was planted. He'd already decided that he was going to save this eagle and it was going to be their new best friend. So he began looking around for something to wrap the young eagle in. And while he was doing that, the young girl began to look for some sign of a mother and father eagle. And not far from where they found the young eagle lying in the bushes, at the base of an old tree underneath some brush, she found the mother and father. And they'd been killed. And she knew in that moment that if this young eagle were to have a chance to live, it would be up to her and her friend. And she walked back to him, and she motioned to the sky and folded her arms over her chest and shook her head, as if to say they were not coming back. And she took the shawl off of her shoulders and knelt down and gently wrapped the young eagle in it. And together, her and the young boy lifted the eagle, and they carried it to their favorite meadow, the one meadow that in all the woods it was the most special to them. In this meadow, the trees were the tallest, the grass the greenest, the flowers the brightest. And there they bandaged the eagle's shoulder, and they built a cage for it, and they caught some young mice to feed it, but it was so weak it wouldn't eat on its own, and so they forced it. But every morning they would get up, and they would change the bandage, and they would bring fresh catch. And by the end of that third day, the eagle had begun to eat on his own. And from that day forward, he began to grow stronger and stronger. And several weeks passed, and the young girl and the young boy got up just as they had always been doing. And they stepped into the meadow, and they froze. The cage was wide open, and the eagle was gone. And they both began looking around, suspecting that someone in the village had found out about their eagle and come and taken it from them, but there wasn't any sign in the morning dew that anyone had been there. And while they were looking around, the young girl happened to glance up, and high in a tree limb above them was the eagle whose life they had saved. And the bandage was off the shoulder and draped over the limb, and she nudged her young friend, and he looked at her, and he looked at her looking up. And when they were both looking up at the eagle bowed to them. And their eyes grew wide because they didn't know much about eagles, but they didn't think eagles bowed to people, much less kids. But then it became stranger still. For the eagle looked down at them, and he spoke. And he said, I want to thank you, my young friends, for having saved my life. But now it is time for me to go. And the young girl shook her head. She said, no, And the boy saying, no, no, stay here, live with us. And the girl's shaking her head. And the eagle said, no, I'm sorry. It's time for me to go. It's time for me to return to the land of the eagles. And their faces grew sad. And the eagle looked at them and said, please, do not be sad. You have done a wonderful thing here. And it is time for me to return to my land. And the boy gets an idea. And he looks up. He says, take us with you. We're small. We don't eat much. And the eagle shook his head, said, no, I'm sorry. This is a very long journey. In fact, I have to fly through the heart of the sun itself. But the girl nudged the boy, trying to get him to plead even more. And he began begging and pleading, said, look, we could be gone days, and the villagers won't miss us. They don't like us anyway. They treat us terribly. And after several minutes of pleading, the eagle closed his eyes and he thought for a moment. And when he opened them, he looked at the children and he said, I will give you the night to think about this. And if this is what you truly wish, you must meet me here tomorrow morning before the sun comes up. But understand that if you choose to make this journey, you may never be able to return again. And they put on these solemn faces and they nodded along with him, and then grins spread across their face, and without another word they turned and they ran out of the meadow and they went back to their homes, and they took what few belongings they thought they might need, and that night they hid in the woods because they didn't want to take any chance come morning of missing this opportunity. And long before the sun came up, they were awake and on their way to this meadow. And when they stepped into the meadow, the eagle was perched on an old stump not far from them, and his tremendous wings outstretched, and he's flexing and stretching and loosening his shoulders. And as the children approached, he bowed to them again, and he said, I see you have decided. And they grinned and shook their heads rapidly, and the eagle said, fine, but understand that this is a long journey. And we will fly through the heart of the sun. And when we pass through the sun, you must close your eyes because the light will be so bright that it will blind you forever. The two just grinned and shook their heads. And the eagle said, fine, come around behind me. And he squatted down and he spread those tremendous wings. And the children came around behind him and they each grabbed a hold of the shoulder. And they no sooner grabbed a hold and the eagle jumped. And he began to beat those wings, and at first it didn't look like he would be able to lift the children. And then inch by inch, he began to climb. And he began to circle the meadow. And before long, he had reached treetop level. And when they reached the tops of the trees, the children looked down off his back, and they saw the villagers coming through the woods. And they knew they had gotten away with it. And they started laughing, and the laughter carries down off the back of the eagle. And the villagers hear it, and they look up, and they see the children on the back of this magnificent eagle. They start hollering and shouting. But by that time, the eagle had climbed so high that their voices were lost in the wind. And in a short while, the eagle, with the girl and the boy upon his back, disappeared into the sky and began that long journey toward the sun. And it seemed an eternity to the children. When they finally approached the sun, the eagle looked back over his shoulders and he said, close your eyes. And they closed their eyes, and the eagle passed right through the heart of the sun. And when he came out the other side and the children opened their eyes, there was a magnificent golden sky around them. And they looked down and they saw this rich green earth. And there were thousands of eagles, all soaring and circling and screeching. And the one whose life they had saved began to circle down. And he landed softly in the grass, and the children slid off his back. And they watched as these thousands of eagles all circled down, landing and forming a great circle around the children. And then together, they bowed to the children. Now the one whose life they had saved stepped forward, and he took his wing, and he brushed it in under his beak, and he pushed it back. It was nothing more than an eagle's head mask, and he shrugged his shoulders, and a suit of feathers dropped to the ground, and they saw this wasn't an eagle at all. This was a spirit person. And then all the other eagles did the same thing. They brushed back their eagle's head mask. They shrugged off their suit of feathers. And the girl and the boy realized this was not the land of the eagles. This was the land of the spirits. And the one whose life they had saved looked at the two of them, and he said, "In time, my young friends, we will make for you your own suit of feathers. We will make for you your own eagle's head mask. And we will teach you how to fly." And the next year and a day was the happiest that the children had ever spent. They got their own suit of feathers. They got their own eagle's head mask. They were taught how to fly, and they would spend their days just soaring, riding the winds across the sky. At the end of that year and a day, though, the boy gets another idea. Wouldn't it be great to go back to the village now? We're eagle people. We can fly. The little girl shook her head, didn't want to have anything to do with it. But the seed was planted, and the boy began talking about it more and more. It'll be different now. We're the eagle people. We can fly. It's still our family. And he convinced the young girl to go along with it. And so the next morning before the sun came up, they put on their suit of feathers and their eagle's head mask, and they took to the sky. And before long, they disappeared in the sky, and they passed back through the heart of the sun, and when they came out the other side, they were circling their village. And the people were just waking up and lighting their morning fires, and they see the shadows of two great birds on the ground, and they look up and they see two beautiful eagles overhead, and they know that this is a sign. This is something wonderful, and they start waking up everyone in the village, and before long the entire village is out watching them. And the two slowly circled down and landed in their midst, and all the villagers just stepped back. And the girl and the boy stood there for a moment, enjoying it. And then together, they brushed back their eagle's head mask. The people were astounded, and they shrugged their suit of feathers off the ground. This is the children! But they'd no sooner taken it all off, and it turned to dust at their feet. But the villagers were amazed. "You flew, you were eagles. Show us how you did this wonderful thing." And they looked at each other, and they looked at what was now nothing more than dust at their feet. And they didn't know what to do. And because they didn't know what to do, they did nothing. And when they did nothing, the mood of the people changed. And the people began to grumble. And then finally someone in the back said, "This is evil. This is bad magic." And someone else picked up a stick and threw it at the children. And they turned and they ran to the woods. The villagers gave chase, hollering, shouting. And the only thing that saved the children was that they knew the woods better than the villagers. But for several days, the superstitious people chased them, the children running and hiding and running and hiding. And when they gave up their search, the girl and the boy knew they could never go back. And they decided to make one last visit to their meadow. And when they stepped into the meadow, what still remained of the cage they had built for the one whose life they had saved was still there. And their eyes went up to that tree limb, and there were still a few threads of old bandage snagged on it. And their hearts in their throat, they lifted their eyes to the sky. But it was empty. And their hearts fell. And they plopped down into the grass. And the tears began to run down their face. And they sat there crying, neither saying a word for the longest time. After a bit, the girl's heart jumped. And she wiped the tears from her eyes, looked at the boy still sobbing next to her, and happened to glance up. And high above them was a tiny speck circling in the sky. And her heart jumped again. And this time the boy felt her heart jump, and he looked at her, and he looked at her looking up, and they watched as his speck began to circle down, and they saw it was the eagle whose life they had saved. And as he lands on that tree limb above them, they're jumping up and down, the boy saying, "Yes, we can go back, we can go back." And the eagle shook his head and said, "No. I'm sorry, my young friends, but you can never return. But you did save my life. And because you saved my life, there is still yet something that I can give you." And with his beak he reached in under his wing and dropped out from under it into the hands of the girl a flute. And he looked at her and he said, "With this flute you will learn to speak. And with the sound that you make from it, it will call the wind. And on the wind that you call, I will be able to fly from the other side of the sun. But it will bring me no closer to you than the sky above." And then he turned to the young boy. And with his beak he reached in under his other wing and dropped out into his hands a rattle. And he looked at the boy and he said, "With this rattle you will learn a new rhythm. And I will come to you in your dreams at night, and I will sing to you a song, so that when your friend is able to call me upon her flute to the sky above, it will be that rhythm and that song that will call me from the sky above to where I now stand. And only when the two of you can do this together, will I give you the last gift I have for you. I will teach you the language of animals." And before they could respond, the eagle took to the sky and soon disappeared. The girl looked at the flute, no idea how to make it sound. The boy frowned at the rattle, thinking, "This is a baby's toy. What am I going to do with this?" But then that night when they went to sleep, the girl's dreams were filled with the song of the flute. And the boy heard the rhythm of the rattle. And the eagle came to him in his dreams and sang to him a song. And even though that next morning they couldn't bring those songs out of the sleep and into the waking, they knew that what the eagle had told them was true. And so they began to work harder, trying to bring those songs into the waking time. A week had passed, and the young girl happened to awaken before the young boy. She could still hear the faint song of the flute from her own dreams. She could hear the boy lying next to her, the rattle moving in his hands as he slept, mumbling a song that she knew was being sung to him. And trying to hold that place between waking and sleeping, she sat up and brought the flute to her mouth. She got her first sound, and a breeze brushed across her. And as the sound began to smooth out, the breeze grew steady, and the boy began to stir. And he sat up. He had the rhythm, and they looked at each other, and they knew they were getting closer. Several more days passed, and the young girl awoke yet again before the young boy, still hearing the faint song of the flute from her own dreams. She could hear the rattle moving in his hands as he slept, mumbling a song that he knew was being sung to him. And again, holding that place between waking and sleeping, she sat up and decided today would be the day. And a breeze brushed across them. And as she played, the breeze grew steady, and the boy began to stir. And he began to whisper those words that had been sung to him night after night. And his eyes popped open. He knew the words. And he looked at her and she looked at him. And together they looked up. And high above them, the eagle was soaring in the sky. And as the girl continued to play, the boy stood and he sang to the eagle the song that had been sung to him night after night. And the eagle circled down and landed on that tree limb above them. And he bowed to the children and he said, "You have learned well, my young friends, but today the lessons truly begin, because from this day forth, I will teach you the language of animals. I will teach you how to speak with nature." In every tradition and every society upon this planet, there have been teachings of a time in which humans could speak as freely with the natural world as what they could with each other. Every tradition upon this planet taught that the only way that the divine, no matter how you define those divine forces in the universe, could talk to humans was through nature. And the only way humans could understand what the divine was saying to them about their life was by studying nature. Particularly those aspects that caught our attention, particularly those animals that crossed our path. And when we have this phenomena of common threads, common teachings running through every tradition upon the planet, especially when they had no contact with each other, it should make little bells go off in our head and says, look, we have something truly universal here, something truly wonderful that we should be paying attention to. And every tradition taught that it was through the natural world that the divine communicated to humans. The problem was trying to figure out what that message truly was and not become superstitious about it. Because it's very easy to recognize or think that something is a sign, but if you really weren't sure, if you really weren't sure of its meaning, if you really weren't sure if you were just being superstitious, it could create problems for you. And so one of the things that was required, especially by the early shamans, was that a person had to study nature. They had to not only know the myths and the tales, but they also had to study those aspects of the natural world that were most significant, because it was only by combining that scientific aspect with the myth that the interpretation could become accurate, that you could avoid becoming superstitious in the process. For example, there's an old superstition about Valentine's Day that says that whatever bird you first encounter on Valentine's Day will tell you the kind of individual that you will ultimately marry. If it's a blackbird or a crow, it's someone who's a little bit serious or somber, maybe a little bit mystical. If it's a goldfinch, it's a wealthy individual. If it's a redbird or a cardinal, it's someone who's filled with vitality and sexuality. If it's a woodpecker, you're never getting married. This is, of course, a superstition. It has nothing to do with the reality. But the ancient shamans knew that if you really wanted to avoid becoming superstitious, you had to study those aspects of the natural world that caught your attention. And so in this program, we're going to try and teach you how to recognize those signs, how to work with them. We're going to take a look at those common threads that ran through all traditions, so that when you have those animal encounters, whether in waking life or in dream time, you'll be able to understand them a little bit more fully. And where we want to begin is by taking a look at those common threads that ran through all traditions. And the first and most important that was taught in every tradition on this planet was that that animal that has shown up in your life has some kind of spirit associated with it. You don't have to believe that it has some kind of creative intelligence, but you can at least recognize that some spiritual force, some archetypal energy has been playing that it brought it into your life and caused you to attend to it, to pay attention, to recognize it there in your life. It caught your attention for a reason. Every tradition also taught that no animal was any better or any worse than any other animal that showed up in your life. They were all just as spiritual, just as powerful as any other. They just had their own unique qualities, their own unique characteristics, what is sometimes called in the Native American tradition their own medicine. They each had their own unique medicine, but one was neither more spiritual nor more powerful than any other. Unfortunately, in our modern world, especially in the last decade, even with the rise and the resurgence in the studies of modern shamanism, there's a tendency to become superstitious about some of the animals that we encounter, but there's also a tendency to glamorize some. We like to think that some are more powerful, some are more spiritual. And one of the things I often ask people, and it always amazes me, is how many people would like to have a vulture as your totem? And of course, rarely in any seminar or workshop do I see any other than one or two people raise their hands in regards to this. But if you ask the group, how many of you would like to have a black panther as a totem? You get a whole different response. But we have a tendency in the Western world especially to glamorize certain animals, to think that some are more powerful, some are more spiritual than others. Yes, the vulture is the garbage man of the environment. This is the animal that cleans up all the dead carcasses. This is an animal that actually has 40,000 times more resistance to botulism than the human body, which is real good considering what it eats. But what happens is when it is feeding upon these carcasses, its digestive tract elicits a chemical that serves as a bactericide that enables it to derive nutrition from it. If you have vultures showing up in your life, this doesn't mean that you'll start having cravings for roadkill. But what you will find is that your digestive habits will change. Foods you didn't like, you may start to like. Foods you used to be able to eat lots of and never have a problem with may start to disagree with you. You will see a change in your digestive habits. Your digestive habits will shift and change as part of what vulture brings. Now, vulture is also one of the few animals in the wild that goes to the bathroom all over its own legs and feet. Now, this doesn't mean you'll have a problem with incontinence either. One of the things we have to understand is that in the eliminative process associated with the vulture, it eliminates some of that same chemical from the digestive tract. And because they've been walking around on the carcasses, that elimination helps to cleanse the legs and feet of bacteria that would be accumulating. If you have vultures showing up in your life and you find yourself coming down with a cold or flu, do something to stimulate the eliminative system and you can head it off. That's part of vulture medicine. That's part of what it teaches us when it shows up within our life. On the other hand, we can take a look at something like the black panther. This is an animal that has had a tremendous amount of mysticism through the ages. This was an animal that was associated with Dionysus in the Greco-Roman tradition. This was an animal that Dionysus utilized in all of his work and came to be a symbol for him. Dionysus was an individual that was known as the twice born. He was an individual who went through a great period of insanity. He went through a great period of anger and violence before he became a healing figure in that tradition. And it's not unusual to find that those that have the panther as a totem going through their own little insanities, going through their own traumas before the healing actually takes place. Both animals are associated with healing, one very gentle, one very traumatic. The panther, in addition, was an animal that came to be associated with Jesus, a biblical tradition. One of the old Jewish commentaries on the scriptures, what was called the Avodah Zarah, refers to a man who was healed in the name of Jesus ben Panther. Panther was an animal that was associated with the line of Joseph. It was an animal that had to do with healing, traumatic and in dramatic ways. The vulture just heals a little more gently. Among the Pueblo people, the vulture is still highly revered and utilized in many of their healing ceremonies. In the Egyptian tradition, in the Book of the Dead and in other lore, they describe a process that the soul goes through at this change that we call death. And they talk particularly about one of the goddesses, one known as Ma'at. And Ma'at was always depicted either wearing a vulture headdress or holding a single vulture feather. And in these writings and teachings, they talk about how after this change called death, the soul goes into this great chamber, and all the gods and goddesses have gathered around, and there's a huge scale. And the gods and goddesses are going to evaluate the life that you just left to determine what happens to your soul at this particular point. And they're all holding these large stones. And they're each going to ask you a question, and depending upon how you answer that question, that stone is dropped into one side of the scale or the other. And they would ask you questions such as, did you lie? Did you steal? Did you cheat? But usually by the time you got to the end of the line, the scales were weighed against you. The last one in the line was the goddess Ma'at. And she didn't have a stone. All she had was that single vulture feather. But her question was the most important. Because no matter how many stones were weighed against you, if you could answer her question correctly, that single feather would balance the scales and the soul would move on. And her question was very simply, is there one who is glad that you lived? And if you could say yes, the scales would be balanced and the soul would move on. We have to be very, very careful about glamorizing certain animals. No animal is any more spiritual, any more powerful than any other animal. They each just have their own unique qualities, their own unique characteristics. Every tradition also taught that animal that shows up in your life, whether it shows up as a messenger, whether it shows up as one of your lifetime totems, that this animal needs to be studied. It needs to be honored. And we honor that animal first and foremost by studying it. Because the more we know about that animal, its qualities, its characteristics, its behavior, we can figure out more easily how it applies to our own life circumstances. And we can learn to incorporate its qualities and characteristics more effectively within our own individual life situations. Most people know that I work with birds of prey. I've been working with birds of prey for over 2 decades. I have done rehab. I also have my own hawks and owls that I use in educational programs throughout the year in schools, teaching them and helping to educate them in regards to these beautiful wildlife. I've been working with hawks spiritually as well as hands-on for many, many years. I know hawks. I do a tremendous amount of traveling in the course of the year in my car, as well as by airplane. And I probably travel close to 50,000 miles a year teaching in my car. And when I am on the road, if I don't see a hawk in that first half hour to 45 minutes I'm on the road, I get a little bit paranoid. Because I know, by what I know about the hawk and how I've worked with over here, that whether it's right, left, up, down, below, whatever behavior it's displaying, I know where the police are and whether or not they're running radar. Not that I would ever speed, because that would be illegal. But the hawks and falcons have a behavior that is known as kiting. And kiting is where they fly into the wind and they flutter their wings very rapidly as a way of holding their position. Now, in immature members, this is a way of developing muscle control, strength, things along this line. In adult members, it's usually because they've spotted a prey and they're setting up to make the strike. Over the years in my work with hawk, knowing that this is a natural behavior, in my meditations, I've asked that if there's something that I need to be aware of, if there's something ready to make a strike at me, this is the behavior I want to see. I want to see that kiting. And inevitably, when I am on the road and I see the kiting, it won't be more than a couple miles down the road that I begin to see something going on. The police are running radar, there's an accident, there's some kind of trouble. The more you know about the animal, the more you honor it, and the more you can incorporate its qualities into our own unique life circumstances. Every tradition also taught that you will always have more than one animal guide, one animal totem. And I think what we need to explore here is that a totem technically is anything of the natural world that has significance for us. It can be a stone, a tree, a flower. We're focusing on animals today, but it can be anything of the natural world that has significance. But we will need to understand that most traditions taught that that animal that is with you off and on throughout your whole life, what is sometimes called a power animal or lifetime totem, is an animal that reflects a very dynamic aspect of your soul, of your spirit. And we can have any number of these that are lifetime totems. Depending on the tradition, there may be as many as 9 that are with you off and on throughout your entire life. But we will have others that show up just for brief periods in our life to show us how best to accomplish a task, how to resolve an issue. And every tradition upon this planet taught that you will always have more than one animal serving as a guide or a totem for you in your life at any one time. And this is easy to understand if you recognize that there's a process in nature called trophism. And trophism is the interconnectedness of all things within the natural world. The grass absorbs the sunlight. Grasshopper feeds off the grass. Frog eats a grasshopper. Snake eats a frog. Hawk eats a snake. Everything is tied and connected to everything else. Nothing exists by itself. So you will always, at any time in your life, have more than one animal that will be serving as your guide or as your totem. So let's say, for example, you're having encounters with skunks. Not something I necessarily recommend on a person-to-person basis, but there's a lot of different ways in which we can have encounters. Maybe every night during a week, you drive home from work and you drive through clouds of skunk spray. You get home, you turn on the Discovery Channel on the TV, and there's a program on skunks. You flip the channel, there's Pepe Le Pew. You walk into a store, there's skunk Beanie Baby toys. You're having encounters with skunks. Multiple encounters, all within a relatively short time. And this is significant. It says, look, there's something here. Well, skunk is part of a group of mammals known as the mustelids, and this is the weasel family. This is ferrets and otters and badgers and wolverines and skunks, and they all give off a strong musk fragrance. Skunk just gives it off a little bit more intensely than others. And it's interesting because skunks are a unique animal in that other predators that encounter them usually only have one encounter with them. Rarely is it deadly, but it is most memorable. Skunks are actually fairly polite creatures, and if they are threatened, if they are startled, the first thing that they will do is they will give you a warning. And what they do is they raise their tail and they pound their front feet on the ground. This is a warning. It means, go away. If that is not heeded, the skunk, being the polite creature that it is, will give you a second warning. It turns its back to you. Now this means, really, I'm not kidding, go away. And if that is not heeded, the third thing a skunk will do is he looks over his shoulder. And when he looks over his shoulder, he looks for the face. And all he needs is a single glance of the face, and he can spray anywhere from 10 to 12 feet, 5 to 6 times, very accurately, before he has to kind of go off and reload. If you have skunks showing up in your life, maybe you need to get more clear in the boundaries that you are setting or not setting. Give a warning. Give it a second time, and then let them have it. And like animals that have had this encounter once, the next time they come across the skunk, they make a nice wide perimeter around him. They show the respect that is due it. On the other hand, if you have skunks showing up in your life, you also need to be studying another animal. You need to be studying the great horned owl. And this is because the skunk is its favorite food. And this is primarily because great horned owls have no sense of smell, which is real important if you're going to be eating skunk. And they are an animal, though, that is one of the most aggressive, one of the most powerful birds of prey. They very easily snap the neck of a woodchuck. Very aggressive, very powerful, very easily. About the only other bird of prey that can hold its own against a great horned owl is a golden eagle, and it's a toss of the coin who's going to come out on top. If you have skunks showing up in your life, take a look at the people around you. Who's got the owl characteristics? Because you're going to want to be real clear about boundaries that you set with them. On the other hand, it might also say, you need to get more aggressive in setting your boundaries. But we will always have more than one animal operating in our life at any one time. And when those animals show up, we need to pay attention to them. Yet another thread that ran through every tradition was the idea that the animal chooses you. You don't choose your totems. There's an old occult axiom that says like attracts like, and that animal that is most important or most reflective of something that needs to be taken care of in your own unique life circumstances is the one that will be drawn to you. So if you've got mice showing up in your life and you're trying to connect with eagles, you're going to find yourself very, very frustrated. You need to recognize that that animal that is showing up in your life is the one that's got the message for you in regards to a situation. And then recognize that it will always be more than one at the same time. The other thing that people recognized in all traditions was that we can share totems. That yes, I may be working with hawks, other people may be working with hawks, but even though we may share or have a similar totem or animal, we still have to develop our own unique relationship. There are lots of people out there that are working with hawk and hawk medicine. There's not a lot of people necessarily using them for radar detectors like I often do when I'm traveling, but you still have to develop your own unique relationship with it. You need to study the animal. You need to find ways of incorporating its qualities, its medicine, into your own unique life circumstances. And when you are able to do that, that is when that animal becomes a true power for you. That's when it really begins to affect your life in a most positive way. And the truth is, everyone in the United States shares the same totem. Totem for the United States is the bald eagle, which I find very, very interesting. It takes a bald eagle about 4.5 to 5 years to actually reach maturity, where it gets a complete set of white head feathers, a complete set of white tail feathers. Immature bald eagles are very obnoxious, very opportunistic, very aggravating to adult members. If we look at this in relationship to the United States, which is a very young, immature country, we've only been around a few hundred years, where most countries in this world have been around hundreds and thousands of years. And what have we aligned ourselves with? Makes us wonder what would probably have happened if we'd gone with Ben Franklin's suggestion and chosen the turkey as our totem. Where would we be today? Every tradition recognized, though, that these are the things that you need to look at. One of the things, though, that there has been a lot of disagreement about is the idea as to whether domestic animals are truly totems. And traditions vary in what they believe in regards to this. Some say that yes, something such as a dog or a cat can be your totem. Others say no, you're working with the domestic animal until you're able to handle its more primal wild counterpart. So for example, if you have a dog, it isn't necessarily the dog that's a totem, but a wild member of the canine family. A fox, a coyote, a wolf, a jackal, a dingo, some wild member of the canine family. If it's a cat, it's a wild member of the feline family. And the nice thing about cats, cats have not been domesticated as long as what dogs have. So usually if you look at the cat, you say, oh yeah, that's a little panther. Oh, that's a little jaguar. That's a little this. We've got some kind of visual clue that gives us a starting point of trying to figure out what the actual totem might be as a member of the feline family. At the same time, though, domestic animals and animals in general, and the more wild the animal, the more this is true, animals are great spirit detectors. And the more wild the animal is, the more quickly they pick up the presence of spirit in our life. Most people, as I mentioned, know that I work with hawks and owls, and these are not pets. They are never treated as pets, but they do have to be somewhat socialized because I go into community centers and I go into schools, and they have to be used to human activity. So one of the ways in which I acclimate my hawks, for example, to being around human activity is I will bring them inside, put them on a stand, and I will go about and do housework around them so they get used to human movement and activity. And it's interesting because if spirit happens to be around, their heads will just turn in unison and focus right where that is at. And then it's my cats. My dogs are kind of dom-de-dom-de-dom-de-dom-de-dom. They just never get it, bless their hearts. But those animals are great spirit detectors for us. So that even if we can't figure out from our domestic animal what our real totem is, at least it serves a wonderful purpose in helping us recognize the presence of spirit in our life. But these are common threads that ran through all traditions. And this always brings up the question then, well, how do I really know if this animal is a totem? Is every animal that shows up in my life a message? Which is a very common question that I receive. And my answer always is yes. Any animal that you attend to or that you see and that captures your attention has a message. It's not necessarily a personal message for you. Sometimes that message is just look at the world around you. Look how magnificent and colorful and unique it is. If it is a personal messenger for you, it will usually show itself in one of two ways. The first way is you will have multiple encounters with it, all within a relatively short time. Like the skunk. You drive through clouds of skunk spray, you start to see it on TV, you're seeing it in stores. Everywhere you go, you're having encounters with it. Multiple times within a relatively short time frame, within 3 to 4 to 5 days. Multiple occurrences. The second is more of an unusual way of recognizing this. It's an extraordinary or out of the ordinary behavior by the animal. For example, it's not that difficult to hear an owl at night. They are nocturnal, they are most active at night other than a few species. And you will more likely hear them, but they are very well camouflaged, so you rarely see them at night. So to see an owl is a very rare occasion. It is something unique, it is something extraordinary. If you see an owl in the daytime, you're getting what I call a clue by four upside the head. It's saying, look, this is something very significant. This is out of the ordinary. Pay attention to it. So any out of the ordinary behavior by that animal is something that is very, very significant. And those are the two most common ways of recognizing if this animal is a personal message for you. How do we go about determining what our totems are, though, other than this? Well, a totem, technically, as I said, is anything of the natural world that has significance for us. Animal totems come in and serve a variety of purposes. We can have totems that are with us just for short periods in our life. We can have some that are with us off and on throughout our entire life that are called power animals or lifetime totems. Some will show up only at times where we need some healing in our life, and their qualities and their characteristics and their behaviors will help us to understand what the healing process is needed for that particular condition. We have others that will show up as protectors to help us recognize that there may be some possible problems, discomforts, or even trouble in some area of our life and show us the best way of resolving it. But they serve a variety of purposes. But there are some simple ways of figuring out what your actual lifetime totems are. Some will tell you that you have to do the vision quest where you go off into nature by yourself and you do some fasting and meditating and special rituals. And don't get me wrong, it is a very powerful, very transformative kind of ritual. But there's a lot easier ways of figuring out what your totems are. And the easiest way is by simply asking yourself some very, very simple questions. What animal or animals have you most been drawn to your entire life? There's an old occult axiom again that like attracts like. And those animals that we've been drawn to are resonating with us in some form or fashion. If you have children and you take them to a zoo or a nature center at the end of that visit, what animal or animals are they most excited about? And if it's more than one child, it's always a different animal. But if you study that animal, you get some tremendously unique insight into the individuality of that particular child. You get some unique insight into their creativity and in how to work with them a little bit more effectively to bring out their natural abilities. Are there certain animals that you see more often on a regular basis? Take a look at the animals that are living in your own backyard. They aren't necessarily totems, but you're living in the same environment as these animals. And so those animals that you see on a daily basis in your own front and backyard are animals that can show you how to live in that environment much more successfully. There is something that they can teach you. Do you dream of certain animals? Every tradition on this planet taught that if you dream of the animal, it is the same as having an actual face-to-face waking encounter with it. Most traditions didn't separate the waking time from the dream time. They recognized that they were two realities, both as important as the other. And the interesting thing is about dream animals is that there's usually other characteristics, other qualities within that dream that will help you to pinpoint where this animal and its qualities should apply in your life. So if you dream of this turtle walking through the office environment, then obviously the qualities of this turtle have something to do with what's going on in your work environment and gives you a place to start figuring out how to apply its qualities and its characteristics. And that's the nice thing about dream animals. And those dream animals can be animals that are our lifetime totems. You know, most people, especially in the United States, don't have elephants wandering through their backyards. But that doesn't mean that an elephant can't be your lifetime totem. You may dream about it. It may be an animal that you've always been drawn to. It may be an animal that you had a connection with and developed a relationship with in a previous life. You don't have to necessarily have a waking time face-to-face encounter with the animal for it to be your totem. There are other ways of connecting with it through dream time and through what resonates with us. Are there certain animals that you're afraid of? Every tradition taught that those animals that we fear are some of our most important totems. Those animals that we are uncomfortable around or have fears of are animals that can help us to resolve recurring issues within our life. They are the animals that can help us to understand how to resolve those things that keep happening to us. I often hear people saying, well, you know, they keep running into the same situation over and over and over again. Take a look at that animal or those animals that you are uncomfortable around or that you may even have a fear of. Because they usually have the qualities and the characteristics that will show you how to change what has been happening, how to break that pattern, how to resolve it once and for all. Those animals that you're afraid of, you don't have to learn to cuddle up with, but recognize that they may have some qualities, some characteristics that would be very beneficial for you to learn to connect with and to resolve some recurring problems. There are two animals in particular that we seem to find a greater number of people having fears about. And the unfortunate thing is a lot of the animals that people fear, especially in these two in particular, are more social fears and have nothing to do with the actual encounter with the animal. One of these, of course, is the snake. The snake is an animal that has a tremendous amount of myth associated with it. It also is an animal that has a tremendous amount of misconception associated with it. And people fear this animal, and it may have nothing whatsoever to do with an actual encounter of it. And a lot of it is social fears that are passed on to us through society. This is an amazing animal. Snakes, from the moment they're born to the moment they die, they never stop growing. I find this absolutely amazing, especially when we compare it sometimes to humans who reach a certain point and then just never seem to quite move on beyond that. They never stop growing. They shed their skin because they've outgrown it. It no longer fits them. This is the one animal that universally, every tradition on this planet recognized it as a healing archetype. This is an animal associated with life, death, and rebirth. And in every tradition on this planet. And it's very, very significant. That's something that we need to pay attention to. You don't have to learn to cuddle up with it, but recognize that it's got some qualities that may help you in some particular areas of your life. For many years, I was associated with a nature center in Ohio, and I worked in their animal program. I also served as one of their trail guides, taking groups of kids out into nature. And I always loved doing the snake programs with it because it allowed us to break down some of the myths and misconceptions about this animal. And we did snake programs in a room that had a tile floor. If you know tile floors, they get a lot of foot traffic. They also accumulate a lot of dirt. And one of the most predominant myths about snakes is that they are slimy. Well, they're not slimy. They have scales which are shiny, and a lot of species of snakes will soak themselves in water prior to shedding as a way of helping to loosen the skin. This just makes them wet. It doesn't make them slimy. So one of the things I would always do with the kids is wherever they were sitting on the tile floor, is I would have them just wipe their hands back and forth on the floor around them, and then we'd hold up and compare to see who had the dirtiest hands. Parents and teachers loved me for this. And then I would take the tail of one of our snakes that I was using that day and wipe it all over the floor and take a white cloth and wipe it, and there wouldn't be a speck of dust or dirt on it. Now, first of all, this proves that humans truly are slimier than snakes. But second of all, it helps to demonstrate the fact that if there was any moisture or sliminess associated with this animal, it would get bogged down as it moved through the grasses and the dirt. A lot of our fears and misconceptions have nothing to do with reality. The other thing that bothers people about the snake is the tongue going in and out. This is how it senses the world. It smells. It has at the roof of its mouth what's called a Jacobson organ. And the tongue reaches out, captures air particles, brings it to the roof of the mouth. It's able to assess whether there's food, danger, what's going on in the immediate environment. And people see this and they don't understand what's going on. Yes, snakes have two eyes. They don't see very well. They rely on this sense of smell. You have snakes showing up in your life. Don't trust what you see. Trust what smells right to you. That's going to be the key. And it's interesting because at the end of the programs that I do with the kids, is I will take the snake around and I'll let them pet it and touch it so they can feel what it's really like. And every once in a while, you go to hold it out to an adult in the group and you get, oh no, this is the kids' time. And it immediately shatters everything that you've just tried to do. A lot of our fears of animals are social fears and have nothing to do with actual contact with it. If there's an animal that you are afraid of, recognize that this is one of your most important totems. This is an animal that has great significance for you. You don't have to learn to cuddle up with it, but you do have to recognize that there are some qualities, some characteristics that it has that can help you in some important areas of your life. Go to the library. Go to the children's section of the library. Get a children's book on the animal, because children's books will present the outstanding characteristics and will do so in a very non-threatening way. And recognize that this animal is significant to you and to some area of your life. The second animal that people seem to have the greatest fear of is, of course, the spider. Now, spiders are not insects. They're part of a different group of animal life known as arachnids. But they are amazing animals. All spiders spin silk, and spider silk is the strongest substance that we've found upon this planet. And if we had a way of harvesting it, it would take a fraction of an inch of spider silk to equal the strength of 1-inch steel cable. We just don't know how to harvest it. Now, most of the spiders that we encounter in the northern hemisphere are web spinners of one sort or another. And the interesting thing is people don't understand why spiders don't get caught in their own webs. And it's really very simple. Yes, their legs do exude a little bit of an oil, but only some of the threads of a spider web are sticky. And the next time you come across the spider web, you can touch the two different kinds of threads and see that this is true. Those threads that go around in a kind of circular circumference type of pattern have all the sticky on them. Those that go out as spokes from the center have no sticky, and that's what the spider uses. Now, knowing this about spiders, if you've got spiders showing up in your life, don't be taking the roundabout way of dealing with things, or you're going to get entangled. You're going to get caught. Be straight, be direct. Spiders have 8 eyes. They don't see very well. They rely on little fibers on their leg that are sensitive to the subtlest of movement. Spiders show up in your life. Don't trust what you see. Trust what feels right to you. And spiders are amazing animals. They're great economists. I love them. They spin the web and then they sit back and let the food come to them. Kind of an arachnid carry-out service. I love that about them. It's terrific. And for those of you that may have a little bit of fear of spiders, here's some trivia that will help you to sleep better at night. Spiders serve a tremendously vital function within the natural world. They are the ones that help control the insect population. And the insect population is the largest group of animal life we have upon this planet. Now, in order to do this, spiders themselves have to be rather plentiful. And in fact, they are so plentiful that, did you know that you're never more than 3 feet from a spider? If there is an animal that you are afraid of, you don't have to cuddle up with it, but you need to recognize that this is an important animal to some area of your life. Go to the library, go to the children's section library, learn something about it. And you'll find that it will help to transform some of those patterns that you've had so much difficulty with. And it's interesting too, because those animals that we seem to have the greatest fear of, particularly snakes and spiders, are often the animals that have some kind of toxicity associated with them. You know, the snakes have venom, the spiders have the toxic as well. And it's interesting because when an animal that has some kind of toxin or some kind of venom associated with it shows up in your life, it's a real nice, clear message. It says, look, there's some kind of change of chemistry going on around you. Either the chemistry of your own body's about to change or the chemistry of your life is going to change. Take a look at this. It's a very, very significant message, and we need to pay attention to that. When it comes to the spiders, people are often worried, especially in the northern hemisphere in the United States. Will say, well, you know, the black widow's a very, very venomous. Rarely, unless there's a allergic response, is there going to be anything fatal. Then they say the brown recluse and things like this. But people don't understand that many of the spiders that are very, very poisonous aren't capable of penetrating the skin of the human body. The most poisonous spider in our country is what we call the daddy longlegs. It is the most poisonous, the most toxic venom associated with it, but its mouth and its fangs are so small that it is impossible for it to penetrate the human skin. Even baby skin, it cannot do it. Even the brown recluse, which people often talk about, needs assistance to be able to penetrate the skin. Most people have problems with the brown recluse when it's in their clothes and they pull their clothes on or they roll over on it. It's adding that extra pressure to it that enables its fangs to actually penetrate. It cannot do it by itself. So we need to educate ourselves, especially about those animals that we have a fear of.